UN sanctions are restrictive measures that are applied by the UN Security Council to maintain international peace and security. Most of the UN sanctions regimes are associated with armed conflict. So intervening to obtain a ceasefire, to support peace negotiations, to try to reinforce peace-building purposes. So about more than 50% of UN sanctions are associated with armed conflict. But significantly, the UN has also been engaged in countering terrorism. In the 1990s, it was initially against state terrorism. And then, of course, in the late 90s and early 2000s, it started focusing on terrorism from non-state armed groups.
Sanctions are decided at political and diplomatic level, and Switzerland really believes that they are a very important tool when it comes to sustaining international peace and security. At the same time, what evidence has showed us is that in those last decades especially, is that there are very negative impact of these sanctions on humanitarian action, and as a result on the population that humanitarian actors try to solve.
For NGOs and UN agencies, it's becoming increasingly difficult to operate in heavily sanctioned countries. They can face delays, they can face problems accessing bank accounts, making transactions as well, but also they may have to shift the focus of their work. And sometimes they find it challenging to carry out their work according to the humanitarian principles.
As Norwegian Refugee Council, we've worked a lot on looking at how sanctions, how counterterrorism measures impact our ability to implement principled humanitarian action. Sanctions can really affect our ability to engage with non-state armed groups who have essentially been designated as terrorist organizations. As humanitarian organizations, it's extremely important that we're able to engage with non-state armed groups in order to facilitate our access to people who are in need. Communities who are under the control of non-state armed groups are generally where the humanitarian needs are the most. It's so essential that we're able to talk to these people and negotiate our access to communities in need. If we're not able to talk to these groups, we tend to call it the chilling effect, where organizations, because they're in fear of the sanctions environment, they may implement programs elsewhere when these non-state armed groups are not operating. The banking sector also have a responsibility to the sanctions that are in place. This then makes it very difficult for humanitarian organizations to transfer their funds into these areas. One of the biggest impacts of the sanctions environment is really on the banking sector and the private sector as well, who really see humanitarian organizations as high-risk customers for low profits.
Mitigating the unintended consequences of sanctions, particularly with regard to humanitarian impacts, has become one of the really big challenges for policymakers, particularly in relation to how to ensure that sanctions remain an effective and legitimate tool in the future. The surprising thing is that there's a lot going on behind the scenes. There are policymakers in a variety of different countries and organizations working really hard to try and find solutions to these problems. But what we find to be key is bringing them together in a way that they can exchange best practice, build capacity, learn from some of the recommendations that come out of the scholarly reports, and ultimately benefit from a community that spans the policy and science divide, that enables those who are designing the sanctions to start making some changes to minimize and mitigate the humanitarian impacts. The problem is that the policymakers who are designing the sanctions don't always have the time or the wherewithal to consult this body of work. And so a big challenge here is how to synthesize and disseminate the information in a way that can be adopted and actioned by those in governments.
UN Sanctions App is actually a very good illustration of what GSPI is all about. It was a means of dissemination from a scientific research project that involved 50 individuals from around the world, actually, both scholars and policy practitioners on the instrument of targeted sanction. The purpose of creating the app, and this was a political purpose, was to level the playing field, to give elected members of the UN Security Council, who are only on the council for 2 years, enhance their capacity, enhance their ability to interact when it comes to the design of sanctions at the UN Security Council. So if you're sitting in a meeting, you could actually reach to your phone and you could download information that you could use either to challenge permanent members on the council, or it could be used to actually make better designed Security Council resolutions. So the whole idea was knowledge is power, that you need to get information. Let's improve the capacity of the elected members of the UN Security Council.
We identified a gap in the knowledge that existed out there in terms of some of the ways in which sanctions can have an impact on humanitarian assistance, on global trade, on global finance, and also direct impacts on civilians as well. And so what we wanted to do is take the UN Sanctions app, which is a fantastic resource that's widely used by policymakers and people in the UN and so on, and add a humanitarian angle to it, because through our cumulative work we identified that this is becoming a really big issue in the sanctions world. We're almost reaching something of a crisis point when it comes to sanctions and humanitarian impacts.
We had a clear need to understand better the way sanctions are designed, the thought process that goes into it, and the information itself in terms of what sanctions include and how it's relevant to our work.
So Switzerland, we traditionally are very engaged when it comes to humanitarian action, and we, of course, always try to intervene when we see a risk that humanitarian action can be criminalized. And in that sense, the UN app is a very useful tool. We really commend that effort, also because it really helps humanitarian organizations to better navigate around the sanction regimes, to better understand also what it means for them from a more operational perspective. Resolution 2664 is a great achievement because it really gives a general exception to humanitarian organization working under a regime which is sanctioned, and that allows them then to have the ability to operate, and that is, of course, it's really helpful in the way that they will be delivering their work.
So Resolution 2664 was a major win, I would say, for the humanitarian community. We had been pushing for 10 years now, I think, for humanitarian exemptions. So it gives us that level of protection to be able to do our work, and for private actors and banks to do work with us in order to meet humanitarian needs on the ground.
It's a very significant development, and in part it reflects the response of governments to the criticism from the humanitarian community of the widespread unintended humanitarian impacts of even highly targeted sanctions regimes.
Switzerland joined the Security Council this year. It's going to be for 2 years. We have a non-permanent seat, first time ever in our history. So when it comes to specifically on the resolution 2664, now that it's being adopted, I think we would really aim for its full implementation. One way that we could help as Switzerland is maybe to develop some guidance for states on how really they could implement this resolution. I think more broadly on our priorities within the Security Council, we will certainly work towards enforcing a better respect for the protection of civilians and implementation of international humanitarian law. If you consider the way that the conflicts are currently being fought, I think sadly there's still a lot that needs to be done.